everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Andrea and today I will be talking about some of the best books that I've read this year. I'm going to combine in this video both fiction and nonfiction, mostly because my fiction reading has really suffered this year. I haven't read as much fiction as any years before. 95% of all the books I read were nonfiction, and multiple times I've combined my nonfiction reading with various books and with an experience of some sort. So that was also very interesting. So the first half of the year, I read only Inuit literature, and I discovered a lot of Inuit folk legends and fairy tales and all kinds of art. And at the same time, all of the nonfiction felt very in between because it was analysis of folklore, analysis of legends, or things about the Inuit traditions, or gathering of oral stories from indigenous elders. So it was very different, and at the same time I'm not sure if I would label it fiction or nonfiction because it's deeply embedded into people's traditions and way of living, and at the same time it's part of their history and it tells us a lot about their culture. Of the lot, my favorite book was probably Cosmology and Shamanism. And again, these were students who interviewed their elders about cosmology and shamanism. So you get a lot of stories and a lot of Q&A kind of presentation, and you learn a lot about traditions from up north. I think none of it is probably one of the least talked about provinces of Canada, and Iqaluit is so small. It's such a fascinating culture, and I want to learn even more about it, and I'm so grateful that recently a bookstore opened in Toronto specifically about Inuit literature. It's called Inhabit Books. I'm gonna link to it down below. If you ever find yourself in Toronto, if you don't already live here, I highly recommend you go. And they also have a website so you can order books online as well. And I also mentioned in my Inuit literature video that if I had to pick one, I would pick the one about folklore and legends, because that one kind of captures various voices but also looks at people, animals, a lot of transformation stories, but it also has an introduction that kind of brings in the nonfiction. So that was one big bubble of my early months of the year. The second one was learning about Canadian artist, folk artist Maud Lewis. And here I would recommend the book Our Maud by Ray Cronin, because he not only wrote the most up-to-date book, but it also includes the aftermath of the movie being made, Maudie, with Ethan Hawke and Sally Hawkins. It's assessing her life, it's biographical, but it also looks at the context of her artwork and how people interpreted it and what people did with it and how we feel about her artwork now. I think that's probably one of the highlights of my year, having gone to see the actual house in Halifax and seeing her actual artwork live. That was such a treat, and I read a lot of books about Maud Lewis leading up to that event. So these two things kind of took up the first 5 months of my year. Now I'm gonna get into the 5 top books of my year, which are the nonfiction ones at least. At number 5, I have Young Benjamin Franklin by Nick Bunker. This book looks at young Benjamin Franklin, but it starts with his great-grandfather in England. And you learn a lot about the members of Benjamin Franklin's family and how many inventors and scientists and men of letters were in his family. And you learn about the religious tensions and political tensions in England, which led to his father immigrating to America, and what his experience was like back then. There's so much in this book about Benjamin Franklin's life that you would have never considered, because we're always introduced to this man in his older days, right? Like when he was old, we had Washington be the first president. So it's like a very different timeline than you'd expect. And America is still new. So you get a very muddy America, and you get introduced to a lot of tension between people, political tension it is. And it's fascinating. It was such a well-researched book. I think if I was face to face with this topic and I didn't know how to lay the groundwork, it'd be really difficult to find all this information. There's not a lot you can get from that far back. And the way Bunker put all of this together and found it, but also constructed it in such a way that it tells like a linear narrative and you feel like you're there. Like I kind of felt like I was in that mini series John Adams, you know, like it was so well told. Second book that I really, really loved was Ahab's Rolling Sea. This is written by Richard J. King, and I have read 3 books by him this year. Another one was Audubon at Sea, and the other one was Sailing Alone. And this was kind of a collection of people who decided to sail the world by themselves and actually published a memoir of some sort about it. And that book came out this year. But from the 3, if I had to pick one, I would say Ahab's Rolling Sea was my favorite. And here we kind of look through Moby Dick, how Melville wrote it, all of his influences. But as we go through it, he takes every little bit of natural history, whether it's an albatross, a whale, a pigeon, whatever, a puffin, whatever has ever been mentioned in Moby Dick, and he tells us the natural history or science of it. So you learn along the way. I would say this is such a great companion to Moby Dick if you're gonna read it, to have this science-y book next to it that's nonfiction that tells you so much more. And it tells you not only about nature, but also about the literary influences, the historical influences. It links a lot to The Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick. It does a lot in one book, and it's so pleasant. It's such an enjoyable read. You have so much fun. I would definitely read it again, and I think I will. Okay, the third and second book in nonfiction are kind of hybrid fiction and nonfiction, which is something I've noticed a lot in my reading this year. So the first one is Weird Tales. And the Weird Tales magazine started in 1923, and this anthology captures the 100 years. And in it, we have samples. So we have actual fictional works like The Call of Cthulhu, Up From Slavery, and several other weird fiction works of fiction writers. But every other art that we get presented with is both in the form of an illustration from one of the many Weird Tale magazines, and we'll get a nonfiction piece. So we'll get an introduction to occult detective fiction, an introduction to sword and sorcery, an introduction to H.P. Lovecraft's weird fiction circle. We get an introduction to Robert E. Howard. We get an introduction to the entire magazine and all of its editors that it's had over the years, and its readership and how it's still going. So for me, coming to weird fiction more seriously this year, this was a treasure. I love this book, and it's also so beautiful. I've done an entire review on this book. I'll link it somewhere, but it's such a great combination of fiction and nonfiction, and it just keeps the love for weird fiction so alive. Like, the fire is burning through the entire reading because you want to know more about something, and then you get an explanation, and then you get another example, and you get all of the masters here. You have Bradbury, you have newer writers, so many good ones. The other book that was incredibly well written and served again as a fiction and nonfiction at the same time was George Saunders' book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain. So this is kind of like close reading of Russian literature short stories combined with writing advice. And you know, close reading. It's almost like the booktube experience if you were very, very smart or something. Like, it's just such a great, great reading experience. You have the master of the short story, George Saunders, talk to you about Russian short stories. And the collection in here is phenomenal. There are short stories that I wouldn't have read otherwise, but there are short stories in here that I think if I read them without his analysis and without his commentary, I would have found them so boring or so uninteresting. And his commentary made them interesting. And it was such a weird experience because, again, these were masters in their craft too. You have Turgenev, you have Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and Chekhov has at least 3 stories in here. And they are masters in their craft, but there was something about the way George Saunders talked about it that made it so much more. It was an experience. It was like mind blown. I don't even know how to describe it. And if you happen to also enjoy audiobooks, you could pair this up so nicely, because the audiobook is done in such a way where the short story is read to you by a very famous actor like Nick Offerman or Glenn Close, and then the commentary is done by George Saunders himself. So you get kind of a very cool, elaborate experience. I do recommend reading this book at least twice, because you need to know going in just how fantastic it's going to be, but then there'll be stuff you missed because of its presentation, because you have the story first and then the commentary, with the exception of the first story where you get one paragraph and then commentary. So then you miss a lot of things, and then George Saunders brings them to your attention later, so then you want to go back. But it's the perfect book if you love just listening to other people talk about their close reading experience, if you want writing advice, or if you want inside the brain of a writer and to look for things they look for, or to assess what a writer would think as they're brainstorming things or placing things together like a puzzle. It'll make you consider writing from a totally different perspective, and I think every reader needs to have this skill as well, which is why this book was just top notch. And my favorite nonfiction book of the year, top one, is the Medieval Scriptorium by Sarah J. Charles. I've done an entire video on this recently, but this is the book about medieval manuscript production and what it was like to live in a monastery during the Middle Ages. What were the materials needed for creating medieval manuscripts, from ink to pigments to parchment to the quills, everything involved in book production, everything around the monastery and the lifestyle. You think about every aspect of being a monk in this book, from their daily routines to their community impact to the shift in different kinds of monasticism. And then you also have close-ups for some historical manuscripts like the Book of Kells, like the Lindisfarne Gospels. And you get to follow the journey of a single manuscript or a single codex, and it's just such a wonderfully researched book, and it's well written. I was hooked the entire time. Now, shifting a bit over to the fiction side of things, I did not read that much fiction this year. I did read a lot of weird fiction, again bringing it back to that weird fiction anthology. I think what I'd like to mention is that William Hope Hodgson took up some time. I read his occult detective, Carnecki, and really enjoyed that. It's like an occult version of Sherlock Holmes, and he has his own really cool tools. But the one I really cherished was The Boats of the Glen Carrig. And this was such a cool hybrid of something that was literary and beautiful, but it's mixed with this weird fiction spin on things, and it's got this pulpy vibe to it. Everything about this book was so great. It starts off 5 days into already being stranded out at sea on this ship, and you have weird noises. When the people go on shore, there's weird giant mushrooms and creatures and people, trees. Just everything's weird, but in the best way. I really enjoyed this. I'm gonna go on a little bit of a Hodgson ride next year, I hope, because I want to read a lot more of the things that he has written. But this was definitely a highlight. I mean, objectively speaking, the most well-written book that I've read this year was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. The more I think about it, the more I can appreciate its craft. She knows what she's doing when she's writing. This is about a young man who lives inside of this labyrinth. He's trying to figure out why he's there. There are a few other characters, but it is a mystery, and it keeps like unfolding like a flower, you know. The more you learn about something, the more you want to know about something else. It's beautifully constructed. It has beautiful language. It's got so much intrigue. It's well written. It's well written. That's all I can say. Did I personally enjoy the entire story? No, but only because I wasn't taken by surprise and I saw some things coming. and it resembled, for me at least, a lot of Stranger Things, a TV show, especially in season 4 in the lab scenes. But that said, the book itself was just so well written. Another one that I really cherished was H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. I made a whole video on Antarctica, and because of it, Antarctica took up a lot of space in my head this year. I read 2 books about Ernest Shackleton. One of them was his memoir, but it was written by a ghostwriter called South. And then the other one was about the leadership skills of Ernest Shackleton. So in a weird way, for a whole month, I was mentally in Antarctica as well. And this book is also so well written for the time period that it was written in, where you have this expedition in Antarctica, heavily influenced by Shackleton. Another topic that took up a big chunk of my time was thinking about artificial intelligence. And the first thing I read was the Wild Robot trilogy for children in anticipation of the movie coming out. And it was about this robot washing up on an island and learning behaviors as if it was a program from the animals around her. And the other book that I read was a short story collection by Ted Chiang. And in this book, you have some stories tackling AI from a much more grown-up perspective than the Wild Robot trilogy. But I also went to see Ted Chiang speak in person, and that was kind of leading up to it. But AI kind of took a big space in my head, and I think I would definitely recommend these 2 side by side, one for children and one for adults, to make you ask bigger questions about artificial intelligence, since it's now in the foreground of public discourse. The last book that I'm going to mention is the one that I personally enjoyed the most, okay? Is it the most literary? No. But did I enjoy this one the most? Yes. And that's this Weird Tales collection, From the Depths and Other Strange Tales of the Sea, edited by Mike Ashley. This is one of those books from the British Library. They have a whole series. I think they have a subscription box to these. I have at least 13, but this one started me on my weird fiction journey this year. It just reminded me how much I love weird tales. And most importantly, it reminded me how much I love nautical horror. That's definitely my niche and my genre. I love reading about the sea. I could read about the sea all day, every day. And if it's a little creepy and a little weird, it's even better. It has weird ships, it has ghosts, it has haunted things, it has unsettling feelings, and it has multiple writers. So it introduces you to so many new voices that are usually not anthologized. So I really enjoyed this book very, very much. So that is my reading list for this year in a nutshell. All of the things that I loved and enjoyed, and these were the highlights. It will be interesting to see where they stand in a few years and how many of them still stick in my brain as memorable. I probably won't be seeing you until the new year, so my next video will be in January sometime. So thank you all very much for watching and for sticking with me this year, and I'm so glad to be back on BookTube this year. I'm so glad I made that choice. Thank you very much, and happy holidays, and have a happy and wonderful new year.